So you'll hear some different perspectives from this group of people tonight. This is not your ordinary economics lecture by any means. These are in many respects sort of controversial views. They just happen to be right and very important. And one of the things that I'm going to talk about tonight is why they're so important. Because those of you who can see the slides, you can actually go and make a strong statement that says we don't have to have high unemployment anymore. We don't have to have uncontrolled financial crises. We don't have to have all the bad things that go along with a recession. We have the ability in a country like the United States or other countries that have their own currencies and their own real central banks, we have the tools necessary to resolve all those things. This is a really big deal in a sense that's very important, and the reasons that people have for standing in the way of doing those things are really just not valid, and that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about tonight. So just to start out, a lot of this stuff results from misunderstandings. And I'll get into that. There's also, tonight, at least for my remarks, I'm going to be focusing on the demand side of economics rather than the supply side. They're both very important and have to go hand in hand for an economy to be successful. But a lot of times when there's a lack of demand in a country, like in the U.S. or in Spain or wherever it is, people go after things that are really supply side. They're trying to improve productivity, which is a great thing to do. But when you don't have the demand, it doesn't do any good. If you've got an automobile factory that's producing 10,000 cars and you make it more efficient so it can now produce 11,000 cars, well, that's terrific. But if you're only selling 8,000 cars, then it doesn't matter that you can now produce 11 instead of 10. In the long run, if you can get people to buy 11,000 cars, then that's great. But to concentrate on supply side only, making the economy more efficient, which a lot of the political rhetoric is addressed to, misses the fact that unless people spend money, nothing happens. And that's a fundamental economic issue. I think you'll find, I can speak for myself, but I think you'll find all of us are private sector people. You know, we're not trying to propose that the government take over everything. It's just that when there are problems, the government has a role to play. Private sector drives the majority of things, but the presumption that the private sector will always produce what we need to have a full employment economy and an economy without financial crises is just clearly not wrong. And anyone who says that, as many politicians do, are just dreaming. They're playing in some fantasy world. So the government can do a lot of things. A number of prominent economists have actually come out and said, well, the austerity that's been going on around the world, in the U.S. and particularly in Europe, is really not a good idea, and a lot of people are getting harmed by it. But almost nobody gets to the heart of the things that stand in the way, in an economic sense, of getting beyond the austerity. The fundamental ways in which government finance works. Now, I'm not talking here about the political things. You have to deal with politics always, but some of the politics is almost religious. It just says, I don't care about inflation or debt or whatever it is. I just don't want government to spend any money, period. I just believe in that. And there's no way that we can address those people. But to people who say, well, we think that if the government spends money, even in a recession, it's going to cause inflation, or we can't afford it, or we're going to run out of money, that we can address. So here are some allegations. The first set of misunderstandings that I'm going to talk about tonight is that the belief that the federal budget has to be balanced in the U.S. or in any comparable country, and that you just have to pay for things. And you often hear people, politicians in particular, say, well, you have this picture of them around the kitchen table with a family or with the farmers saying, well, you have to balance your budget. You can't spend more money than you take in, so we the government, should do the same thing. Well, that's wrong for two very important reasons. First of all, it's not even true of the businesses and the farms. A lot of farmers buy equipment for money that's much more than they're taking in any given year. So the principle that the politicians are talking about doesn't even apply to the farmer. But more importantly than that, the idea that the finances of the federal government are like the finances of a family, or like the finances of a farm, is just an incredible leap of faith. It's like saying that we should think of the oceans as just an accumulation of a bunch of bathtubs full of water. I mean, yes, they both have water in them, but the nature of them is just totally different, and you have to stop and think what really makes sense for the government versus a family or a business. The concept of running out of money, you often hear, well, we can't do this. We've convinced ourselves, and a lot of other countries have convinced themselves, but it's particularly a shame for America. We've convinced ourselves that we can no longer afford to do a lot of the things that we used to do that were really good for us and good for the world as a whole. And it's just wrong. We don't have to think about running out of money. And my colleagues tonight have written about this from different perspectives. It's just a very strange concept. Another real misunderstanding is one of the things about running out of money that's a strange concept for the federal government is that the government can create money. Okay, so if our family could create money, it would put us in a very different circumstance. The government can create money, and the question often is raised, isn't that a problem? I'll come back to that. Another big misunderstanding is what's called national debt. National debt is when the government issues Treasury securities to pay for something, pay for a new highway or fixing up the highways or a new airport or cleaning up the environment, whatever it might be that the government's going to pay for. It often has to be financed by issuing treasuries. Treasuries are called national debt, but the word debt is a very misleading term. It's to think of national debt treasuries again as similar to the debt of a person or a family or even a corporation is just not sensible. And when you start to walk through and say, what is the real nature of a treasury security, it turns out that it is the safest and most liquid way of holding a financial asset in U.S. dollars. It is much better than money. There's a misunderstanding that money is some special stuff, okay, that's got God-given characteristics to it or something like that. In fact, money is just a liability of commercial banks. That's all it is. And it's just as risky as your bank is. And that's one of the things that came out to light in 2008. All of a sudden, people realized, hey, my money is not safe. And it happened in spades in the 1930s. Almost all money, except for the money you carry around in your pocket on pieces of paper, which is a very small proportion of the total, is simply a liability of a bank. It just means the bank is standing behind it, but it's only as good as the strength of the bank, whereas a U.S. Treasury is as good as the strength of the United States of America. There's nothing that can be safer or stronger, and it's just a very different concept. The other thing about treasuries that's misunderstood is you often hear people talking about this great burden of debt that is going to fall to our children and our grandchildren, okay? Well, I have some family here tonight and some grandchildren at home, and I promise you they're not going to have to worry about it, okay? First of all, the notion that it has to be repaid just defies history. The total of Treasury securities outstanding has always gone up in the United States. It's gone down a little bit from time to time, rarely in a few of the Clinton administration years, but that's really the only time in the past 50 years. In 200 years, it's never been fully paid off. It just grows. It's just another form of financial asset that's all out there. And it's actually, in total, more than the total money there is in the United States anyway. So the concept that people are going to take money and pay off the treasuries, it just doesn't make any sense, and it never happens. The amount of taxes that we as citizens paid to pay off what's called the national debt last year was zero. The amount we're going to pay this year is zero. The amount we're going to pay next year is zero. The amount that our grandchildren are going to pay is zero. Just, it's the wrong concept. So, and treasuries also, like money, comprise a fairly small proportion of total financial assets in America. America has a huge financial system, and sometimes when you hear the politicians talk, they make it sound as if the national debt is so immense that it's just staggering in our whole economic picture. It's actually the U.S. Treasuries outstanding are only about 7% of the total financial assets in the United States. When you look at all the things there are, there's stocks and bonds and real estate securities and pension funds and a whole bunch of different things. It's just not so major. Money. Again, it's just not well understood. The concept of money supply, you hear a lot about it, and some people complain that Mr. Bernanke, among others, was raising the money supply too rapidly. But even the word money supply is an odd concept, because that's not the way the banking system works. It's very much a common view that that's what banks do. They take deposits from some mysterious place and then lend it to people. But it's just not possible. You can't do that. It's sort of left over from the old days when banks used to take bags of gold in from depositors and then you turn around and lend the gold to somebody. But it doesn't work that way. Nowadays, every time a bank makes a loan, it creates new money. It literally creates money. And it wouldn't be possible for me to take your deposit and give it to somebody else, because if I were a banker, like I used to be, because I still owe you the money. How can I take your money but the other guy has to have money. When I lend money to a borrower, he has to be able to spend it. So I have to create new money. That's what happens. So there is no money supply in the ordinary sense of the word. There is simply the ability of the banking system to create money as it creates loans. That concept really underpins a lot of other things that go on. Again, Warren may have more to say about this. Now, I'm going to have to talk a little bit about what are called reserves in the banking system. Banks themselves don't have money in the ordinary sense, because since money is a liability of a bank can't have a liability to itself. It has to have a liability. It has to have an asset that's a liability of the central bank. So the Federal Reserve in the U.S., the central bank, the European Central Bank, the Central Bank of China, whoever it is. Those funds that the banks have are called reserves. And there are required reserves, which are a certain percentage required by law, and the rest are excess reserves. And that really what creates the liquidity for the banking system. Those banks, though, those reserves can be used only in transactions between one bank and another bank, or between the bank and the central bank. They're not like money that can be lent to somebody. It's just not the way the system works. So when you hear somebody say, well, the central bank is creating all this money and now we want the banks to lend it out, that's a statement. I don't know if Mr. Bernanke's ever said that. He's probably too smart to say that. That just doesn't make sense. It can't work that way. It's just not possible. So let me go on now to quantitative easing. When quantitative easing was executed by the Fed, they bought securities in the market and they created money in the accounts of the people who sold it. So the people, if one of you had a Treasury bond and you sold it to the Fed, you still had the same amount of total financial assets. It's just that you had it now in a bank deposit called money instead of having it in a bond. This created about $2.5 trillion of new deposits in the banking system. Again, you often hear questions about, well, why don't the banks lend that money out? Well, they can't. It's just not possible. And that $2.5 trillion is going to still there, and it's going to stay there until those bonds are paid down. Again, it just reflects the reason I'm going into all this. Partly, it's the topic that that Rohan set up for the evening, but partly it's because there's a whole series of misunderstandings that underpin a lot of this that lead to bad policy decisions. So here, now I'm going to get to this point, and this is all sort of set up for the rest of the discussion this evening. A lot of people make the assertion that we cannot afford to do this, cannot afford to do that, whatever it is. There's $2 trillion worth of repair that needs to be done in America's bridges, tunnels, roads. Any of you who drove here tonight through the potholes have a good example of that. And when Liz and I came in from China yesterday, we saw not only a really poor airport compared to what's in China, but the road from the airport to the city was just in no decent shape. And so that's $2 trillion that could be spent that would create jobs and give us a better infrastructure that we could use in the future. We could build schools, we could improve the environment, a whole bunch of things. People say, no, we can't afford to do that because of two fundamental reasons from a money sense. One is that if we created money to do it, it would be too much money, and that too much money would cause inflation. In fact, we've added $2.5 trillion worth of money in the past few years through the Fed, and there's been almost no inflation at all. Matter of fact, it's so bad, the Fed nowadays is trying to create inflation. So the assertion that when there's more money there will automatically be more inflation is clearly wrong. It's just interesting how people's minds work. They can't acknowledge the facts. They grew up somehow, they're learning this, that more money means inflation, and they see clear evidence that it's not true, and they can't support the logic, but they still believe it. So that fear stands in the way of people. The second is that we'll have too much national debt. If we have too much national debt, there are going to be all kinds of terrible consequences. And in fact, that's not been the case at all. National debt, what's called national debt, which I like to call just the issuance of U.S. Treasuries, has gone up very dramatically over a period of time. By the way, it's gone up under every president, including Republican presidents. Went up significantly under President Reagan, significantly under President Bush. And that's not a complaint. It's just that often people say, well, it's the Democrats who do this, and in fact, it's every president. It's just not a problem, and should not stand in the way. All the fears that people had, there was a period of time, it was on one of the previous slides, when there was a lot of attention to what were called the bond vigilantes. The idea that there was going to be so much national debt outstanding, so many treasuries, that the bond market was going to revolt against it, and the U.S. Treasury would have to come to its knees. And that's clearly been shown to be ridiculous. And now they've backed off. But for years and years, every year they would say, this is the year the bond market's finally going to be killed by excess issuance of treasuries. And then it didn't happen. Then they'd say it was next year. And then they'd say it was next year. It never happens. So we got two choices. I'm near the end here. We got two choices. We can accept all that misunderstanding and say, what are we going to do next time we have a serious recession, or even now when there's significant underemployment and crumbling infrastructure? What are the things that we tend to do? We rely solely on monetary policy and the Fed. We try to do a few things on the supply side, maybe a little bit on the demand side. It's way too little. And my favorite is hoping that things will get better. That's the main strategy that Washington, D.C. has been using for years now. But the consequences of that are recession or slow growth, a lot of unemployment, a lot of underemployment, job insecurity, declining infrastructure, all these things which are really bad for the nation as a whole and for individual human beings who are affected by the failure of government to do the right things because people don't understand how the government financial system works. We've got another choice. We can say, wait a minute, let's think through these things. When people say you can't repair the infrastructure by issuing treasuries to get the funds, you say, well, why is that? What's the problem? Let's analyze what the problem is rather than just simply saying it can't be done. Or even creating money, which Paul may comment on more. If you go through all those things, you find, well, maybe there are some minor issues that come up if you go ahead and do these things, but they're really minor, especially in comparison to the problems we know we've had these past several years of a financial crisis, millions of people out of jobs, low employment, very high job insecurity, crumbling infrastructure. Those are problems we know are real, and we shouldn't, it just makes no sense to let these sort of fake problems stand in our way just because people don't understand and government finance. So we can deal with all these things. You know, there's just no reason to have a recession again, no reason to have a financial crisis again, no reason to have sustained unemployment. It can all be dealt with. All right, after the presentations by Warren and by Paul, we'll be happy to talk about any issues you'd like. Thank you. 50 years from now, people will look back, economists will look back and chuckle. They said, did people really believe that the government was going to run out of money? How naive they must have been then.